It reminds me of the very first broadcast I made in 1940, helped by my sister. We as children spoke from here at Windsor to children who had been evacuated from their homes and sent away for their own safety. Today, once again, many will feel a painful sense of separation from their loved ones. But now as then, we know deep down that it is the right thing to do. While we have faced challenges before, this one is different. This time we join with all nations across the globe in a common endeavor, using the great advances of science and our instinctive compassion to heal. We will succeed, and that success will belong to every one of us. We should take comfort that while we may have more still to endure, better days will return. We will be with our friends again. We will be with our families again. We will meet again.
Thank you to the BBC for that recording. Let me repeat one sentence in there that really struck me and Paul Herman. And though self-isolating may at times be hard, many people of all faiths and of none are discovering that it presents an opportunity to slow down, pause, and reflect in prayer or meditation. Adding to that, it's also imperative that we should act. One thing that has struck me is we have all rediscovered the importance of community, of the incredibly important role that health workers, the emergency services, teachers, the people that stack the shelves or drive the buses, and so many more play in keeping everyday life simply working, often for very little pay. So it has been very inspiring to reflect on people who have been prepared to stand up and act and try to drive change themselves. One is Estelle D, a high school student in the Blue Mountains in Sydney, who is campaigning, well, I'll let her tell her own story.
Here we are. I'm Estelle D and I'm chairing this session, which is called Time for Action. Just before I introduce you to our panel, I want to give you an example of an action that's needed in our schools. After the last school strike, academic scholars like Alan Jones and Andrew Bolt encouraged us to go back to school and learn. Well, here is what I learned. I found a government-funded report by the School Energy Productivity Program. It said that New South Wales could save $45 million every year by installing more LED lighting and solar panels in our schools. In addition to saving $45 million a year, it would also reduce annual emissions by 154,000 tonnes of CO2 a year. So before these adults criticise us for going on strike, maybe they should learn to stop wasting so much money. The action I want to see is for the New South Wales government to put LED lighting and big solar panel systems into every New South Wales public school within 3 years. If the politicians won't do it to save the planet, at least do it to save money. Speaking of that,
Leaving aside the environmental benefits, that initiative would reduce power costs, allow power to be exported into the grid to meet the peak power demand, which in Australia is now in the late afternoon and early evening because of the power already coming from solar during the middle of the day, and would generate a significant number of jobs too. Thank you for joining us on ESGX Live. Next week, we have a fascinating discussion about the future of work and what we should all be doing now to prepare for the very different future that lies ahead. Register at esgx.org to join us for crisis, creativity, and collaboration. And now, with no more ado, I will hand over to Paul Herman to introduce today's episode.
Welcome, everybody, to ESGX, the free online global community that informs, inspires, so you can take action locally, regionally, and globally. We're excited today to introduce today's focus on activating academia for climate action. And we have three excellent panelists, three excellent groups of panelists. One is focused on students, how students can be more active. on campus and in the community. The second is how faculty can be more engaged and teach the curriculum that includes climate action. And finally, professionals, including those connected to endowments, for how all the resources of a university can be focused on making change. So Doug Heskey of New Day Investing is our guest MC today. We want to thank New Day Impact Investing, Hip Investor, and Pottinger for organizing this series. It's typically weekly Tuesdays at 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern in the Americas, in the evening in Europe and Africa, and in the morning, it's Saturday morning in Australia and Asia Pacific. It's also the anniversary of Verse Week, and excited that this is the 10-year anniversary of the Hip Investor book that you see here. It's actually in 28 universities in part of the curricula of undergrad, as well as MBAs and MPAs. Because this is the 50-year anniversary of Earth Week, this is the fourth event this week. You can find them all on ESGX.org. You can see the New York Times headline from 50 years ago today, when I was 1 year old, that millions joined Earth Day. And the first Earth Day was actually called almost called the Environmental Teach-In. And so Dennis Hayes helped co-found Earth Day, and we celebrate the 50-year anniversary of seeking to take even more climate action and to be able to do it on campus, like is happening over hundreds of campuses around the world, doing it in the classroom by teaching how to think and how to act, and by doing it in our everyday work, donations to universities, and how those resources are invested. So I'm going to turn it over to Doug to moderate us and welcome everybody. I want to thank the panelists for being here and look forward to delving in deeper. Please remember to use the chat box and the question and answer box to join us. Thanks.
Great. Good afternoon, everybody. Good evening. Good morning. Thank you, Paul and Nigel. It's not happenstance that we are hosting today's event on activating academia, as May will mark the end of the undergraduate year for almost 4 million graduating students just here in the United States. And while this year's graduation ceremonies are going to be quite different than years in the past, they are no less important, as many of these graduating students will be the future leaders of tomorrow, as they are every year upon graduation. New Day has organized our final ESGX Earth Week event with Pottinger and Hip Investor, entitled Activating Academia, because the academia community at large serves a critical role in helping transform our world to a better and more responsible place, especially as we begin the rebuilding process post-COVID-19. And this time, we have an opportunity to build America, to build the world the right way. At the core of the work that we do at New Day is the idea that by unleashing the younger generation's vigor for deep and lasting change, by providing them a mechanism for engagement that's more grassroots, we allow them to share their collectivized desire to change the world. New Day is a participatory impact engagement platform whereby responsibly minded individuals and institutions can get educated, can get involved, and they can get invested in the issues that they care most about. A critical part of our work is educating our community on financial literacy, inclusion, empowerment, and the broad swath of impact and sustainability issues that we focus on today with our partners. We have now built relationships with more than 30 different educational institutions, doing speaking events, engaging with student ambassadors, and employing interns that have worked for all of our organizations on sustainability projects. Some of these interns have actually transitioned into full-time roles at New Day, at Hip Investor, and our other partners. The New Day Impact Index is now a component in the Securities Industry Association National Stock Market Game that's taught to almost 800,000 students around the United States through 15,000 teachers and 12,000 educational institutions in the K through 12 area. In 2018, the stock market game introduced for the first time an opportunity for students to learn about the merits of values-based investing in building their own hypothetical investment portfolios. And we're not alone in pursuing change, and our partners like the SIFMA Foundation and others are critical collaborators in this effort. Some of these partners join us today, all of whom recognize that this work is a shared challenge that needs to be done together to solve our global issues. More information about our work can be found at newdayimpact.com or through our new educational platform at horizon.newdayimpact.com. In celebration of this 50th anniversary of Earth Week, it's my pleasure to introduce 12 leaders in impact education and finance. All of these individuals have been big contributors in advancing the cause of impact education at their colleges or universities or in their professional careers. This afternoon's discussion will be broken out, as Paul had referenced, into 3 sections: a student panel where students from 3 universities will speak about how they individually are leading change in their personal lives and their educational careers; a faculty panel where professors will discuss how they are teaching students about the values of sustainable thinking; and finally, a professional impact panel who will discuss their perspectives on how to be climate heroes and advocates for change in business and or in college and university endowments. So it's my pleasure to introduce our 3 moderators that will be joining this discussion this afternoon. Peter Lupoff, who's currently CEO of Net Impact, a global movement of leaders using their skills and careers to build a more just and sustainable world. Dr. Lesley Sakura, professor of management and the founding director of the Ethics in Action Center at Menlo College. And Katie Kawachi, program manager at Intentional Endowments Network, a network for endowment fiduciaries, CIOs, and other decision makers to learn from peers and experts about investing for a thriving and sustainable economy. So before I turn things over to Peter, I'd like to invite all of our participants to introduce yourselves on the chat feature this afternoon and to submit questions through our Q&A tab. So without further ado, allow me to introduce Peter Lupoff, the CEO of Net Impact. Thanks, Peter.
Thanks very much, Doug, and welcome everybody. Our panel discussion will be with 3, it's sort of perfect for the work that I do. We activate engagement amongst the next gen community. There are campus-based and or young professionals through our professional chapter network, about 150, 160,000 people worldwide. And today I've got 3 emerging leaders who have been inspired and are increasingly equipped to foment a just and sustainable world. And I'd like to go around and ask you 3 to introduce yourselves and talk about how you came to find engagement and activation on campus. And then I'll come back and I'll tease out some more information about the work that you did there and the work that you're doing now and where you see things going. So perhaps we could start with Angwin.
Yeah, sure. Hello, can you hear me all right?
Yep.
Perfect. My name is Angwin, and I am a 3rd-year student studying economics and business at Minerva Schools at KGI, a school that is based in San Francisco, but every semester the students go to a different city and a different country to not only learn in the class, but also to engage with the local organizations on different projects. What I came about here is that the idea that throughout my projects, my years of being a student, I have engaged in different projects, and one of the most meaningful projects that I've ever had was my summer internship at New Day Impact Investing. And a little bit of that is that I learned so much about the idea of power. So for instance, if we talk about powers in the past, we would think that the government would be the unit or the entity that's governing our lives. But today, I think when we see the world is really governed by companies, which at the time when I learned about this, I felt sad as well as disempowered. But through my internships at New Day, I realized that although these companies are super powerful, these companies are also getting the money and the profit from the consumers, which are people like me and you. So I think really the idea of power being on us, it's really empowering, and it really invites me as a student to invest my effort and energy in the right things and in the right brands, as well as solving the right problems. And perhaps we can also talk more on the right problems, because I think I can share more about the right problems that I'm currently working on. Thank you.
Awesome. That's terrific. Thank you, Angwin. Alex, could you fill us in on your background, how you came to be activated in the space?
Hi, everyone. My name's Alex. I am currently a master's student at the University of Rhode Island, getting my master's in environmental science and management. And my passion for the environment started in high school. I took a environmental studies course, and I learned all about all these horrible things happening in the environment. And I became so frustrated that so many people didn't care. So it was really in that class where I, started growing this really strong drive to change this and to be one of the people who are, fighting a little bit for sustainability and for our environment, really. So I went to Providence College before the University of Rhode Island. And, I really wanted to pursue this field. And they didn't have an environmental studies major. So I looked at majors at other schools and kind of compiled an environmental studies major at that school.
I got it back. I got it back.
Taking
You're Bye.
Hi, Lesley. Welcome back. If you can mute now. Thanks.
I was taking classes from, political science and sociology, as well as biology and chemistry and things like that. And I was able to kind of put together a major that suited me perfectly. While I was there, I worked as a sustainability coordinator, which was really great. I had the opportunity there to basically walk around campus and find issues, sustainability issues that I could work on and improve. So some of my projects that I worked on there involved with educating other students about recycling and energy efficiency. I also, for a short time, went to the University of Colorado at Boulder, where I was an eco rep, which is basically like a student sustainability leader responsible for being involved in certain programs that help educate our peers in the dorms about all sorts of issues related to sustainability. And so when I came back to Providence College to finish my education, I had the opportunity to bring this program back to Providence College. So right now it's up and running today, and it's a great opportunity for other students to get involved and be sustainability leaders there as well. So I one of the moments where I felt like I truly I really felt energized about being in this field, and I felt like I truly found my passion and my purpose was when I delivered my first speech at a rally for action on climate change in 2017. And I'd never felt so energized and hopeful for my future, being surrounded by all these people who were so passionate about the environment and protecting it, and putting all other plans aside to be there and to stand up for what they felt was right. From then I met a couple people in the Sunrise Movement, which is basically a group of young people who are fighting for an equitable future. And these brave students are, standing up to politicians, demanding action on climate change, and they're making massive steps. It's really inspiring being a part of that group and seeing my peers, take these issues into their own hands. There's individual hubs all over the nation. If you go to sunrisemovement.org, it's a great, opportunity to get involved wherever you are. And, in my opinion, the best way to get involved is to get educated on these issues, whether that means taking a class or joining webinars like this one, talking to family and friends, people that care about your opinion, right? Like telling them why this stuff is important to you and educating them on things that they can do. And, one of my favorite things is just standing up in front of a crowd, telling my story, sharing my passions. educating the public about the importance of taking environmental action now. So I really think that getting involved in these activist groups has been a really, transformative process for me to just learn the power that I have as an individual. So thanks.
Thanks. So thanks very much, Alex. And move on to OSA, and perhaps you could give us a feel too for how you found a way to get activated through the campus experience.
Thank you very much, Peter. I'm also here. I'm a grad student at NYU. I have a bachelor's degree in engineering, and I think a couple of weeks ago, NYU, my department, so I'm a grad student at NYU, master's in public administration and nonprofit administration, specializing in social impacts, innovation, and investments. And my cohort, we held a symposium on social impact and investing, and that's how I met Doug Hasta, the CEO of New Day. That's how I came to be on this panel. At Wagner, NYU Wagner, I have the opportunity to actually have a focused curriculum on social impact and investing, and I know that I'm quite fortunate to have that. But what I found, what bothers me the most and what I put most of my time into is making sure that we can democratize this social impact space. Those of us who are passionate about social impact, we will go through tooth and nail, and we will do whatever it takes for us to do the right thing, to invest in the right places. But I think it would be unfair of us, let me use that word, to expect that the general public is going to have that passion. So a lot of my work is focused on making sure that investing in social impact, investing in social firms is as easy as you would invest in traditional firms. People should understand social returns, people should understand social impact, and they should have access in the same way, or at least access to knowledge in the same way that we would for traditional firms. And in nod to what Angwin had said, growing up, I realized really early that governments couldn't solve all our problems as society. They couldn't tackle everything. What I found the most, and at the time I didn't know what social firms were called, were that these firms that had social purpose were the ones who actually had made an impact on the lives of the community. And that was what I decided to focus my efforts on. And also, like, in nod to Dr. Marianne Newitt, she mentioned that she's the director of communication, and how we communicate social impact, how we make it, how accessible we make it to people is one of my passions, and that's what I work on. And I can speak more on the kinds of work that I do.
So I'm going to follow up with you next and sort of shake up the order here a little bit, but and then focus on some things that each of you have mentioned that really, to me, as a one-time educator and impact investor, now the role I sit in, for the people on the call, just to amplify this message about this sort of youthful demographic that is wise in many ways. And you mentioned you mentioned the democratization of impact investing, and you also talk a little bit about, maybe these are my own words, sort of the failure of the sovereign or of governments to make the difference, and the obligation that we human beings may have to one another to fix those things. It's really, could you talk a little bit more about that aspect of
yeah, that's a very good question. I'll address the sovereign part first, and then I'll come back to democratizing social impact. Governments, like their reach is limited, as well as their funds. Part of the work I'm doing is actually looking at municipal bonds, and how, especially at times like this, the governments can't find funding to do what they want to do, and they also aren't as aware of the problems of the society like a firm would. They can't respond to the problems of society as a firm would respond. I think it was Adam Smith who said, "We do not expect bread from the generosity of the baker," but because he's looking out for making sure his own business runs. In the same way, the governments don't have the same kind of attentiveness to the needs of people. This is what I think it is. Of course, we can talk about corrupt leaders and all that, but I'm saying even beyond corruption, which is a problem in itself, there's also just the issue of attention and what do they want. People are looking more to be re-elected than to necessarily do the hard truths and take the hard steps towards moving towards what is a social good. Now, speaking on democratizing impact investing, what many of you who are here, you are in the social impact space, and what you find is that it's, compared to the traditional finance space, it's by far more nebulous, and there are so many more angles you can look at, and there's a lot of things, which is understandable. It's a growing field. And that's why I keep stressing that I think those of us who are in the field, we need to do our homework, we need to do our legwork to make sure that we can encourage other people to come into the field and actually work in here. Because as much as I would love us to do it by ourselves, I think we need a lot more efforts and a lot more capital in this space.
True. Angwin, I'd like to ask you next about, you mentioned the notion of individual power also strikes me as sort of a practitioner's perspective, and we're beginning to see this more and more, that we can assert our rights. This is not foreign from what Osa is intimating as well, that we can drive change ourselves. Could we talk a little bit about that, and also about whatever your passion project is in the area of social responsibility and environmental sustainability?
Yeah, for sure. I think I wanted to snap a lot when Osa was speaking, because I think our points are related, like how it is important now as consumers, we know like where we put our money, both in like purchasing a brand or investing. And then like the more we help these companies who are powerful in doing good things, like the more good things also come back to us. Again, the idea of consumer power, but also a broader idea about this power, like how us as individuals have power. It helps me to think more on like how I can put my effort and energy in things that matters. And then things that matters to me are the right problems. And I like to like share more about like what it means by the right problems. I think in the world we have a lot of problems, and most of problems are more superficial. It's like something's like on top, but underneath there's like the root cause. And sometimes we just focus on like finding the solutions, or just like finding like easy fix to the problems. But if we look deeper, then we can solve the right problem. Then we can also have the greater magnitude of impact. And to me, the way to find the right problem is through empathy, understanding the problem, and then like the users or like the society, as well as through data and research-driven approaches. And from that, I found the right problem that I am passionate about, and that is about sustainability and environment. And more particularly, the right problem in this case is the coal mining industry in Indonesia, which is obviously is bad for the environment in general with the carbon emissions, but it's even more so with the distractions to the society who live around the coal mining industry. Also the agricultural, which is one of the characteristics of Indonesia as a country, which a lot of lands are now infertile because of this coal mining industry. And as well as in the process of like transporting the coal itself, a lot of corals in Indonesia also being destructed. So based on this right problem, my current projects at school, which is my capstone project, is a community solar in Indonesia. So the idea is that instead of having individual solar panel for each household, which is very expensive, then having a distributed solar where solars are being financed by either the government or the investors or people as a group, then we can have the solar panels to be more affordable. So people can even be easier to switch from the coal-based energy as their electricity to solar, which is sustainable. So I think as a student and as the idea of activating academia, I'd like to invite us to think further, or when we see problems, do we see the right problems? Can we dig deeper? Because again, when we solve the right problem, then we can have greater impact.
That's awesome. And then following in a sort of a similar theme about this remarkable notion, I think, amongst you three, that there's this narrow gap between academics and practitionership. You're sort of walking the talk already. I'd like to ask Alex a little bit about, and I don't know if people really picked up on this, but essentially you built your own curriculum because you had an interest in what you wanted to study, and your curriculum, the curriculum didn't exist. And then I'd also like you to talk a little bit about your passion project.
Yeah, so when I was at Providence College, they had biology majors and some majors that were kind of in the right direction, but not exactly what I wanted to do. So I was faced with a an option to kind of make my own major. And it was a lot of work and it took a lot of time. But ultimately, it was extremely rewarding. And I got to look at majors at different schools and working with the help of several professors, kind of piece together, different and essential courses to make up an environmental studies major. And I was really fortunate to have that opportunity. And I also got to learn much more and a lot more about the social aspects of these issues than I would have had I just taken like a biology track and gone with that major instead. And one of the main projects that I was working on when I was at Providence College was just as the sustainability coordinator. My job really was to just walk around and find issues and fix them. I did, several things trying to boost recycling on campus. I know I'm a visual learner, and telling me something, it may not stick as well as seeing something. For example, I cut out a bunch of recyclables that I found in the garbage and I taped them up to this huge sign and I put them in the dining hall, hoping to encourage students to, recycle the right things. I had a sign with things that were for the garbage and other things that were for the recycling. So it would be very, very obvious which goes where. The main thing I worked on was developing an eco-rep program. I was a part of it when I was at Boulder. And it's basically this group of students that meets up weekly and learns about environmental issues and then communicates them to their peers in bulletin boards on the first floor of every resident hall. And there's an eco-rep in each resident hall. And they're the go-to person for questions about sustainability. They also communicate what they learn each week up on that bulletin board. And it was really great to be surrounded by other students who had these similar passions. But also developing it at Providence College was, it was a unique experience and it was very rewarding seeing it grow, and the program is still in place today. I would teach these students every week or so, maybe every other week, about different environmental issues and things that they could do. And I think a lot of the time we're always bogged down with the negatives and like, oh, it's a dreary outlook, but you got to reframe it and tell people what they can do. So it was really, it was a really awesome experience. And I think the program is really valuable in getting people, getting students involved in how they can be leaders in their resident halls, and then kind of, fostering that sense of leadership in the environmental field moving forward.
I think in the final 2 minutes that we have, can I go round robin with each of you? And this is a complete spontaneous question that you've not heard before, but we are living in the time we are in the way that we're living. And I'm wondering if you have a takeaway related to COVID that gives you reason for optimism for the work that you're doing. Whoever wants to jump in first. Let's leave some time, so be quick.
I think this is a very crucial period, and COVID-19 is showing us what the importance of resiliency and how much we need to invest in companies that don't just focus on the day-to-day money, but every part of the economy, but those who provide essential services and those that provide luxury goods that makes in quotes a lot of money. But I think this is a really good period and demonstrates to us the importance. And we saw what happened with the fossil fuel markets. So this again gives us a good opportunity to realize how important these other sectors are.
Awesome. Either Alex,
Yes.
are you done?
So I think COVID-19, especially for students, it is very impactful in a way that it is, some friends are now graduating and more friends are graduating as well. And a lot of times there's like a lot of sad notions about like our job prospects and then how can we also contribute to the world. But something that I'm grateful for this common enemy is the idea that is common enemy. I think before we have different problems in the world, but now we come together as humanity, understanding that these problems is our problem, and not until everyone is helping each other that we can move forward from this challenge. So I am hopeful that out of this COVID-19, we come stronger as generations and as humanity. And I think with the idea of this communality and then the idea of understanding each other, then it will be easier in the long run to collaborate. which I believe that collaborations is one of the key for us to lead a sustainable future, because for sure we cannot just do it alone. We cannot just fight the bad companies alone. We cannot promote the sustainability and green energy alone as well.
Terrific, Angwin. And then Alex, if you could wrap us up with your thought on this, maybe 30 seconds.
Of course. I just think that, watching this all over the world, these massive reduction in pollutions everywhere, Venice seeing clear water, California, where you can see, the sky. I think that it just shows us that like massive rapid change is possible. And I think, despite all this stuff that's going on that's negative, I think that there really are some, just signs that like it's possible that we can make a change, we can make it quick. So thank you.
Beautifully said. Well, thank you, everybody. That wraps up our panel. Reach out to any one of us if you'd like to, and we can correspond through the Zoom webinar chat as well. Thanks. Thanks, Doug.
Great. Peter, thank you very much. I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Lesley Sakura, who is the founder of the Ethics in Action program at Menlo College. So with that, Lesley, take it away.
Okay, I'm here. Nick, can you pop my video back on?
Yep, coming right up.
Super. I'm going to get rolling so that we keep on schedule. My name is Lesley Sakura. I am with Menlo College in Atherton, California, which is at the heart of Silicon Valley. And thank you, Nick. I think I'm back in the game. Perfect. Hi, everybody. And again, my name is Lesley Sakura. I'm just delighted to be here. I want to thank Doug for including me today, and the folks at Pottinger and everybody else who's here to join us. There's an old adage that when the student is ready, the teacher appears. So here are the teachers, but we can't do it without such wonderful, interested students. I've just heard a tremendous amount of capacity, insight, talent, and just commitment already to a new future. And we do have some momentum right now. And so I'm delighted to welcome my expert faculty guests, Elizabeth Davis from St. Mary's College, Travis Brown from Indiana University, and Tim Costell from University of Queensland. All time zones welcome. Thank you, everyone, for coming here and giving some of your day to this very important topic. For those of you who are listening live or in the future, I just want to let you know that this particular panel session is here to support your educational development in the area of ESG. I think if you're listening, you probably have some interest already and may be engaged in this type of educational focus, but we want to help you gain traction. We want to continue to spur your interest and give you some insights to do so. And with the talent that we have here today, I have no doubt that you'll garner some ideas. Building a platform for stakeholder capitalism has become very clear to us is a sustainable future, both for people and the planet. And we're going to hear from some individuals who not only have scholarship in the realm of ESG, but also in innovation and entrepreneurship and technology. And together, those areas of study will fuel further practitioner interests and business partnerships. And the folks that are joining us here today have that kind of experience, as well as understanding the knowledge behind how to make these partnerships and business connections work with regards to triple bottom line and projects that we can really harness some of the passion that we've heard from our students and that we know is out there, and really forge a way forward that works and can build some increased interest now that we've had a little bit of pause to have some inward reflection and hopefully endorse the things that are human within us that help us care about each other. And so without further ado, I wish to include my panelists now to start the discussion. Elizabeth, we welcome you and we'd like you to start. If you just want to give us a little bit of background about yourself and what you do at St. Mary's, and then take a few minutes to tell us about what your interests are and what you'd like to share on this topic.
Thanks, Lesley. And I'd like to tell everybody that I'm currently Dean of the School of Economics and Business at St. Mary's. So my perspective on this particular subject is a little bit different than being in the trenches of, delivering material, as many faculty do. But we're in a very unprecedented time, and Nigel opened this with making that statement. When I hear words like wildfires, drought, power outages, food insecurity, and COVID-19 disease, at one level, that seems to me to be a description of perhaps a country on the other side of the world. But I'm here to tell you that that's St. Mary's in this past year, that these kinds of climate actions and global sustainability issues have come front and center and very, very localized. And once those events really become localized, it's a wake-up call and a level of awareness that, from an academic standpoint, it's no longer something out there, it's something very personal and very clear and very close. The student activists who actually made presentations before this panel give me great hope because they are the student activists who've experienced some of these very localized events. But what happens when you have a whole school or a business school that experiences power outages for 2 weeks? Or like COVID-19, we've all been sheltering in place for 6 weeks. It really does call for a reevaluation. And for many of us, this has been going on for a very long time. Davos 2020 sort of elevated the dialogue to a global scale around global sustainability and climate action by advocating for organizations to really think about this shift from what I would call shareholder capitalism or focus on shareholder return to stakeholder capitalism, which is a shift in the way we see the purpose of the organization. And that has fundamental translation for business schools where we really are talking about individual behavior, organizational behavior, and its relationship to the larger environment. So events like this really call for us to rethink what we're doing in curriculum. And for us in business schools, it's a major opportunity to sort of push forward this idea of the shift of the purpose of the organization to one that is much more focused on the production of stakeholder value than just simply shareholder return. So I'm not naive enough as a business school dean to think that the total elimination of shareholder return should be eliminated from the equation, but it may be necessary but not sufficient for us to educate this next generation of activists to shift the landscape of business so that the voice of business is much more focused on stakeholder value than shareholder return. And the early evidence of really this shift, which has been happening in the last 10 years, really is showing sort of research that would argue that we have better levels of performance financially and culturally and environmentally when we get this shift in mindset from shareholder to stakeholder dynamics. And there's no doubt about that. We see this in all sort of regions of the economy, in social action, and certainly in environmental leadership propositions. But I'm here to argue that it can't be fragmented. In other words, it has to start somewhere. And business schools are responsible for educating this next generation. And for us, this is a major opportunity. Tools, techniques, and the content of much of what we teach is the same, but how we use those tools, techniques can be very, very different. And in service to stakeholder value and the production of stakeholder value versus shareholder return. So I'll stop there.
That was an excellent introduction. I'm gonna see if Travis is here and hooked in.
I am.
Great.
Okay.
You want to join us? Thanks.
Absolutely. So my name is Travis Brown. I'm a senior dean at our technical school here at Indiana University in Bloomington, Indiana. So my background, I came up through technology in a business environment, and then I transitioned into my MBA program. And I'm of a generation where even when I was going through my MBA program, they were really celebrating social entrepreneurship. We had net impact and things of that nature. But when I transitioned into my doctoral program, I was talking about social informatics and things of that nature.
Yeah.
I was being told that's it's somewhat of a naive approach because you're not going to have support from industry. What's been heartening to me, as Elizabeth was saying, is that we have this younger generation. I don't even feel like I'm informing my students. I feel like they're educating me and re-impassioning me because they're telling me that people care about these things.
Mm-hmm.
So when I talk about the triple bottom line and I talk about these elements in respect to my design classes, part of the reason I transitioned from my business program over to the design program is because it seemed to be, as design is traditionally thought of, as more empathic. And so being within that environment, I felt like I was more at home just thinking about the social aspects of enterprise and capitalism and things of that nature. We're at a period of time which actually it inspires me because I feel like young people definitely understand the impact of what they're doing, and consumerism has gotten far more informed. And when they vote with their wallets and they understand what they're doing in respect to purchasing and supporting companies, they're taking the time to understand the impact of that support. And that's radically different from generations past. Even within my own generation, people just weren't thinking about those things. The attitude was that companies weren't going to be mindful of these things because consumers didn't care. But consumers care now.
Yep.
And young people care, consumers care, and companies, this is the nature of free enterprise. Companies are set up to support to Elizabeth's point, they're set up to support their shareholders. That's the nature of what companies are, to the point where you can actually have liability if you don't support your shareholders. We're evolving into a more stakeholder mindset.
Right.
And I think we're to a point now where consumers understand that, and companies are now more beholden to that. And that's the whole notion of ESG, that we now are supporting companies that are mindful of these, of a more holistic perspective. I'm fortunate to be a part of a university that has been doing that for a number of years. That's how I came into this. I would not argue that I've been a part of sustainability or anything that's so profound. I just happen to be in design and business, and I had the opportunity to join what we call the Office of Sustainability. It's a Sustain IU initiative, and that's how I came to know Doug and New Day. And I'm surrounded by students who are very much passionate about supporting all these broader initiatives. But as soon as you start to talk to them about, for-profit businesses and capitalism and anything of that nature, it's hard for them not to embrace this somewhat defeatist attitude. They're like, well, there's no hope. And I think that's where educators can really bridge that gap. Yeah. Like there's room for a marriage between the two. And I think that's where we can lead the way. So that's probably the most succinct way I can say it.
Excellent. Elizabeth did a great job really bringing us to a starting point of recognizing that it's all around us and we're observing it, and it's home and it's us. Travis, you complemented that elegantly by saying, hey, business has been paying attention. The students are game on. And this opportunity right now is really grabbing business to say, hey, maybe some of this opportunity with the design elements is going to really grab on hold strong now. Plus, how we think about profits may be different in the business sector as a result of feeling the sting from COVID as well. I remain exceptionally hopeful in that regard. And in terms of taking action, I'm turning it over to my colleague, Tim, who will speak to that as well as some other insights. Good evening, Tim.
Hello, actually it's morning here, so welcome to the future, everyone. Yeah. So I'm here on Yagara and Turrbal land in Brisbane, Australia. And it's interesting, I think, to mention the Yagara and Turrbal people who have been custodians of this land for 30,000 years, because one of the things that's been interesting for me recently has been working with Indigenous entrepreneurs and also scientists, all of whom take varying degrees of a longer term view, which I think is critical in thinking about all the sorts of things that we're talking about. In terms of background, I'm actually scarily similar to Travis, so I won't go into a lot of detail about what I've done, but a lot of the work that I've been doing recently hasn't so much been teaching students, it's been teaching researchers. So I've been working with a lot of researchers who have been trying to increase the impact of their research. And I think that there's a few different ways that are useful for us as academics to think about that, and that kind of help us with these sorts of issues. So one is that, to my view, a well-functioning academy sits in the middle of everything. So we have the upcoming generation who are going to be the leaders of the future. We have those connections with business. We have connections with researchers and others that are creating all the tools that will help us create the future. And, you know, if we think about how we place ourselves at those intersections, that's where we can really increase impact. And so in the work that I've been doing with a lot of different researchers that have had sustainability-based projects, the real focus, you know, both Elizabeth and Lesley have talked about, well, and Travis as well, have talked about stakeholder capitalism.
Yep.
I've been thinking really hard about essentially stakeholder science. So one of the questions in the chat was, how do we reorient away from just the top tier journals as the things that count? Right. And I think one of the things to be thinking about is, how do we broaden the conversation to talk about impact and to meaningfully talk about the impact of the research that we're having? And so coming from a business school, coming from an entrepreneurship background, I tend to think in business models. And one of the things that I do when I work with the researchers is work really hard to get them to think about all of the stakeholders for their science, because that group is always broader than they expect it to be. And one of the things that's really interesting is that it doesn't really matter if you've invented a parking app or are doing research that's designed to save the Great Barrier Reef. Often the idea that people have in their head about this is how this work will be used, this is the impact that this idea will have, that first idea is almost always wrong. And so we actually have to go through some process of figuring out, what value does this idea actually create for people? Who are the different stakeholders? How can we knit them together? Excellent. And I thought it was really insightful on the student panel previously, the discussion around power, because the other thing in all of this is that if we're really talking about genuine change, it comes at two levels. There's the level of individual change, which we all have direct control over, but there's also the level of systems level change. And we have to be thinking at both levels to be effective. If we only think about either the personal level or the system level, nothing actually happens. And so we have to toggle back and forth between the two. Right. And so, you know, if we think about things that we can do at institutional level, I think there's a few things. One is to reorient that discussion around what counts as scholarship. And so scholarship that has impact has to count more, and we have to start thinking about how that works. I think the second thing is that for those of us in the innovation space, and when we start talking about stakeholders, we have to be talking about the Sustainable Development Goals as targets and as drivers and as a metric of whether or not our ideas are genuinely adding value. And then I think the Times Higher Ed supplement just came out this week with the impact rankings. And universities love to talk about rankings. I think this is one that all of us have to be paying attention to and saying, why aren't we higher on these rankings than we should be? Because it's a direct measure of the impact that universities are having on the SDGs. So I think that, there's a faculty level activism that we can be having. And those of us that have tenure and that those of us that have administrative roles have a really increased amount of responsibility for trying to change what the metrics are for the upcoming academics and the students that are coming along, because that's where we can actually start to amplify our personal level of impact.
I want to go back, and reiterate that once some of this becomes very localized for business schools and for faculty, that's sort of the wake-up call that it's not business as usual, that there has been a landscape shift, and that's happening in a lot of different areas. But for, the academic world, somebody asked about, well, what about rules for, scholarship and R1s? I spent 12 years at George Washington University and understand, very clearly what the R1 requirements are. But as a dean of an AACSB school, I'm here to tell you that in the past 2 to 3 years, there's been an ongoing conversation in those accredited business schools talking about the acceptability of moving and validating responsible management research. And that is a movement that, 5 years ago, we wouldn't have seen. Now we see this in the last 2 to 3 years. And it's incumbent upon deans to go back to their faculty, which I've done, and sell that whole concept. It counts, it's legitimate work, it's high quality work, it's interdisciplinary, and we're willing to accept that. And so there is a movement afoot to begin to accept that shift. But I would also argue that once you get the faculty to recognize these localized effects, all of us put out thousands of students into the marketplace. And it's a huge responsibility. But from a curricular standpoint, now's the time to take advantage of the mind shift. Because as I said, the tools, techniques are all the same. What is different is how you apply them. And that's where we can have a major impact on, business and society by educating this next generation. Not that social impact is something different when you think about business, but business is social impact. And that's the challenge,
I agree, Elizabeth.
How do we do that? And the only way we can do that is through this curricular development and faculty buying in and rerouting the incentives for faculty to say, that's really okay, because that's really the outcomes we want.
Exactly. Well,
Can I just interject here for a second,
sure.
Lesley? There's
Absolutely.
2 questions in the chat box. One of them is, there's a request to hear how each of the professors' view of the curriculum is influenced by student attitudes and interests. That's one. And another is how to help people and businesses move towards internal motivation from external constraints, especially since when people are fearful, it's hard to look far into the future. So how is curriculum influenced by students, and how to motivate everybody in a time of crisis?
Thank you. That's a great question. I will say one thing. I tell my students the qualitative feedback is the most critical feedback. I use every comment, and that does not mean I'm going to extract the writing assignments, but it does mean that I'm going to ask them to write about their own experiences and to figure out who they want to be in the world, and to try to make sure that who they think they are is really activated and to put into action. And we've spoke about something that I write about, which is using your power. Each of you have mentioned that either on the individual meso or macro levels. And we need all of them. And then we also need as a system to link these, which means leadership. And so to educate our students for ESG leadership is critical. And one of the things that it has to do with is metrics. Not only the metrics where we look at our students and their performance and how we might evaluate that, but also the metrics within corporations. And so I'm going to bounce over to you, Travis, and let you respond to this question and see also what your reactions are also to Elizabeth's comment and anything else you want to add.
Actually, that's a perfect segue into, I just wanted to celebrate with what Elizabeth just said, and it actually ties nicely into these questions, which is, I think, how do you really respond to students? It's really difficult as academics, in quotes, to have anything you say resonate with students in a meaningful way, because there's always going to be this perceived separation, this chasm between academia and practice. So what I try to do at a minimum when it comes to students in respect to the projects they take on is I've had projects in my design strategy class, as an example, that are directly related to the sustainability of the campus. So they feel the impact of what they're doing. I just want them to feel that. When it comes to industry, I've worked with companies like Grant Thornton who are engaged in consulting with industry in respect to ESG, and to show students that this is not just some academic exercise. Companies are starting to care about this. Governance is actually being guided by this. Investors care about such things. This is not just a feel-good exercise. This is about climate change. This is about the sustainability of our global environment. These are important things. This is not just academic. So it's easier for me to get them to feel the impact when it's right directly on our campus, whether it be about supplying food to them or their farming initiatives that are right on our campus, but also bringing in industry partners who will tell them these things matter. We're being hired to engage with companies to guide their leadership on these various initiatives. So they're important, they matter. That's probably as succinct as I can be, but hopefully questions a little bit. And I agree with everything Elizabeth said.
Excellent. And Tim, what are your thoughts as we move in additional directions and closing nuggets about how you activate these concerns within the University of Queensland?
So I think one interesting initiative at UQ is we have a thing called Solar UQ. It was started by 4 professors in 2010 from mathematics, physics, engineering, and economics. And they looked at it and they said, you know, we're in one of the sunniest places in the world. How can we not be solar driven? And so it started this whole thing that's cascaded into something that's become university policy. And sometime later this year, a solar farm is going to switch on that's going to make UQ 100% energy neutral. And it's a small thing, but it's you know, it's an impactful thing. So we're generating more power through solar panels than the university uses. So we have net positive back into the grid. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a great example of something starting at an individual level initiative and cascading up into something that's impactful across the whole university and starting to be impactful across Southeast Queensland. And I think that, you know, going back to the question that Peter closed with in the first panel, what's going on with COVID-19 right now, to me, it's really interesting because it's the first time all of the leaders in the world have faced the same test at the same time in a long time. And we're going to see who passes and fails. They can't spin it. And one of the things that's been really interesting is that some of the countries that have been very successful at dealing with it so far have been New Zealand, Australia, South Korea, where a lot of people have contributed to that response. And I think it's also really critical for all of us to remember that, you know, curves bend, but they bend because people are bending them. And so going back to the question of power, the power does sit with us. And I think that's the most important thing for us to remember going forward.
Mm-hmm. Lesley, we have maybe one more question and then we should wrap up and move to our third panel. The question comes from Shalini at Menlo College. If you could share your perspectives on how colleges are reacting to such initiatives and should these be complementary or substitutes to the existing programs?
And the SDGs, how they relate to the SDGs.
Who wants to chime in there?
I'll chime in. initiatives underway, and yes, we should work together. That's
Well, what I would say about the SDGs is that, to some degree, this is about, the shift in the faculty thinking. And if we can shift the mindset of faculty to think of SDGs as the standards of performance for any kind of business, not teach that as something different than the mainstream, but it is the mainstream, then we begin to get sort of the outcomes and the change that we want to see. So, a lot of this, we have fundamentally set up, the kinds of behavior that we already see in business. We also have the power to change that through education. So this is a wake-up call, I think, for business schools in particular. And the other thing I would say is part of this is also putting student success in the center of the equation and calling the question, right? Not just about faculty development and faculty success, but student success. What do we want to see those students do in the future? So I go back to Travis's example. If the kinds of experiential field projects you're choosing for your student engagement, that in and of itself will have an impact down the line. And the more kinds of actions that we choose in that direction, the higher the probability, we have better solutions to COVID-19 or food insecurity on a global scale, or, water scarcity and how we solve those problems.
Well, that's just a very robust and excellent conclusion. Tim and Travis, did you have any final nuggets burning desires you wanted to toss in there before we conclude?
I'm happy to end on Elizabeth's note.
Let's get to it. Yeah, can't all that.
Thank you. One thing, to cop over everything that's been said, I want to thank my experts for their time. And I also just want to say now more than ever before, we have permission to make mistakes. I've written about change for years, and I've used the word transformation and radical so many times and wondered if it was ever actually deployed. We have permission to go forth and exercise new things. So I want to applaud you all for what you're doing at your schools. And I want to thank you, Doug, for you and your colleagues leading today's session, which motivates hopefully faculty, students, and business, which we'll now turn to. So thanks, everyone.
Thanks for the invitation.
Great. Lesley, thank you very much.
Thank
Elizabeth,
you.
Tim, Travis, thank you very much for your leadership. So we're now going to turn our attention and focus to professional impact. We have what are three very accomplished individuals that are joining the session this afternoon. I'd like to introduce them for just a moment. Head of the Sorensen Impact Foundation and Center, Jim Sorensen from Utah. We've got John Taft, who's the Vice Chairman of R.W. Baird. We've got Katie Kawachi, who is the Development Director at the Intentional Endowment Networks. And then we have Austin Halbert, who is running Radius Learning, formerly known as Impact Education out of New York City. So thank you all for joining us here. I'd like to turn things over to Katie as moderator of this session. Thank you, Katie, and thanks all for joining us.
Thank you very much, Doug, and thank you for those introductions. I'm hearing so much momentum and energy from the past two panels on climate action and engaging companies to do better and reassess their role in society beyond maximizing shareholder value. And as an organization working with universities and colleges on these topics, it's really inspiring to hear this. So thank you so much. And just to follow up on Tim's comments from the last panel on what level of change we're looking for, individual or system level, this panel will focus on how each of our organizations are trying to work together to bring about system level change, but through individual, institutional, and community level actions. And just to introduce myself, as Doug mentioned, my name is Kaide Kawauchi. I'm the program manager at the Intentional Endowments Network. And this is a peer learning community supporting university endowments align their investment practices with their institutional mission and sustainability goals. And for this panel, we'll cover how foundations or businesses are approaching and championing the issue of sustainability in their work. And when we say sustainability, as we heard today, we're talking about how we're meeting the needs of today without compromising our ability to meet the needs of the future generation. So all of our work not only focuses on the environmental, but also on the economic and social issues that we have to address. And we hope that this discussion on institutional level work will leave you with the audience members with some ideas on how sustainability action might look at your school and other organizations and how you can get started in this social change work. So I'll turn it over to each of our panelists to introduce themselves further and talk about their organizations. But I also, as the previous panelists did, I like to put this in the context of this pandemic. And so asking each of the panelists to reflect on how your thinking may have changed with this new environment. You know, are you doubling down on your social change strategy, or has there been a rethinking of your approach? So I would like to ask Jim to weigh in first. And Jim, if you can talk about the program side of the Sorensen Impact Foundation and Center, as well as the endowment side and your work around training the next generation, that would be fantastic.
Great. Thank you very much. And I appreciate everyone that's participated, and it's a great honor to be able to speak to you today. I'm president of the Sorensen Impact Foundation and founder. And our expertise really has always been in providing catalytic capital to support social entrepreneurs who are developing sustainable solutions that solve problems and issues for people and communities in need. We are leveraging our strengths and our networks to continue that work with really a new focus at this time, and that is in alleviating the global impact of this pandemic and economic shock. We have carefully analyzed our portfolio impact companies with a lens around COVID, segregating them into 3 categories of response, recovery, and resilience, and prioritizing investments according to where our companies fall into those aspects of the COVID situation today. Initially, we were supporting existing portfolio companies who have stepped up to lead in direct response to the pandemic. And we are also actively evaluating new investments in companies that are responding to the global health crisis, as well as the tangential but also critical issues of exacerbated hunger, poverty, lack of education, lack of work, and all of the chaos that is existing in our world today. Though we may not have focused on preparing for this pandemic or sudden economic shock, for years, many of our portfolio companies have been working to develop solutions that can help in the challenging times like we are faced with now. We have funded companies and organizations that know how to coordinate emergency response in areas without strong healthcare infrastructure, provide education to people who cannot go to a school, deliver healthy food to areas that lack access, and even train and mentor healthcare workers remotely. As we have sought to find solutions for certain regions and environments, we have supportive, innovative companies and organizations that now already, and with our collective support, can rise to the challenges of helping to save lives and try to mitigate the long-term impact of this public health and economic crisis. In this regard, we have taken several steps to try and promote collaboration in the field, which is a top priority for us now, and what really was before the pandemic. We've worked with Village Capital to launch an aggregated deal pipeline that is a technology-driven platform so that investors and entrepreneurs working on COVID response, recovery, and resilience can connect more efficiently. We are sharing our active pipeline and our due diligence to promote more efficient co-investing through that platform, and are inviting others to do so as well. And we really feel that this team-based approach will enable other investors to work alongside us in the due diligence process so that we can move faster and more efficiently. Ultimately, we see great opportunity for investors to be able to work more collaboratively, and I think that's really key for growing the field. I'll just address kind of the second part of your question, and that was really our involvement with education. In 2013, I endowed the Sorensen Impact Center at the University of Utah, and that was really with the goal to provide students with an experiential education in all facets of impact investing. And experiential is really the key. And in so doing, creating a pathway to future careers in impact investing while enabling scarce, low-cost human capital to help build the field. Now, the important objective was really to lower the barrier to entry for families and other early impact investors that were interested in making investments, but found it very challenging to source where they could find impact, how they could do the due diligence, the market research, and really the underwriting that would enable them to be able to make these investments. Through the center, we enable students to be directly involved, working in teams, to be able to bring these impact investment opportunities to interested investors. To date, the center has facilitated more than 150 million in impact investments, assisting more than 125 social entrepreneurs, evaluated over 5,000 companies, and advised over 30 governments nationwide, and have had over 700 students enrolled to date. And I'm pleased to also say that New Day was one of those investments. So I think it's a great opportunity for students. The breadth and depth of the center is really truly unparalleled in providing a 360 perspective of the social impact space. The 4 pillars of student engagement are facilitation of impact investing, education and field building, data science for social good, and innovative government policy. And at the core are the students. So with that, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Jim. And Austin, do you want to chime in here along the themes of supporting students in your business, in your work?
Absolutely. So my name is Austin Halbert. I'm the founder of Radius Learning. We work with companies to expand pathways for youth to discover the jobs of the future. So we've worked with NASA to have systems engineering students design space missions to monitor biodiversity, with Unilever for students in agriculture in the Midwest to chart sustainable food systems, fashion design students to reimagine retail with H&M. And over the past few years, we've really focused on sort of finding those ecosystems of universities, private sector leaders, and government partners to not just understand how we can better solve the challenges we're facing today, but how we can educate the next generation to be able to solve those challenges as well. So more broadly, my work is really focused on how technology plays a role in charting pathways to sustainable economic transitions. So I've done a lot of research across a few continents with public-private partners on that work. And it really came out of, I think, growing up in the rural South in an era of unprecedented crisis, but also unprecedented opportunity, and understanding that we've got more tools at our disposal than ever before to reimagine what the world looks like and who it serves. And I think before I even understood what systems change was seeing that we didn't have the systems in place for our public and private institutions to look out for the common good in the way that our current conditions and future conditions demand. So in a post-COVID world, I think things have looked a lot different for us, just even in the past 72 hours. I can't even think about what the past 3 weeks have looked like, just in terms of the mobilization that's happening. But before COVID, we were really focused on working with universities and individual companies. Now we've shifted focus to public-private partnerships, expanding opportunity with workforce programs, community colleges, and sort of other ecosystems for expanding pathways to students who are out of school, residents who are out of work, and really looking at how this moment can be used to not just connect people back to work and sort of transition our economy back. But now that all of our incentives are aligned at once, how can we upskill our workforce, kind of create economic systems that allow a really powerful and much needed transition to take place?
Thank you, Austin. And John, I'll turn it over to you. Similar question around, what you're doing on the program side, the endowment side, but if you can also touch on the climate action initiative that's part of the Minneapolis Foundation, that would be fantastic.
Well, thank you very much. I'm here, I guess, with several hats on. One is that for the past more than a decade, I've been writing, speaking about what I call responsible finance, which is activity in the financial sector that actually contributes to positive social outcomes instead of some of the behavior that we've seen. What does that look like? What does it take to have more than that? Secondly, I am a vice chairman of an international financial services firm, and one of the roles I play there is to speak to clients. We have more than 300 billion in client assets, about how to go about aligning their investments, actually their entire wealth management program, with their values. And then I also chair the investment committees at the Minneapolis Foundation, as you mentioned, Katie, and the Warhol Foundation. And it's really, I want to focus on those roles. And the number one thing I want to say is that in the world today, the role of asset owners, whether they be foundations like the Minneapolis Foundation, which is a community foundation, or the Warhol Foundation, which is a private foundation, or sovereign wealth funds, or pension funds, or any large pool of assets. Asset owners play a critical role in influencing the behavior of corporate actors and government actors and not-for-profit actors, because they're making decisions about where to invest their money in organization A or organization B. And hopefully, as more and more money flows into strategies that have some element of socially responsible or ESG associated with them, those decisions are being made in a way that rewards responsible corporate behavior. So, importance of asset owners, number one, critical. Number two, I would say, is that I think one of the things we fight against is fuzzy thinking. That is, it is hard. You have to think carefully about exactly what it means to align your investments with your mission or values. Which values? Exactly how do you go about doing that? And then, even having thought through that, there are any number of practical constraints that face organizations that prevent them from doing what they might want to do as fully and completely as they'd like. I will use, for example, the Warhol Foundation, which is all about, it's a $300 million private foundation funded by the sale of Andy Warhol works, licensing, royalties, and so forth, and is the largest maker of grants to artists and arts organizations in America. Well, how do you align our investment activities with that? It has turned out to be quite a complicated thing to think through, even though there is about a 24-person board, and everybody on that board wants to get to the right solution. And the biggest constraint is that when it comes to making impact investments in the creative space, it's still a very immature space, and there aren't particularly attractive ways to deploy the portfolio's assets into impact investments yet. So we're sort of settling for plan B for now, and we are making grants to people trying to develop that space. And then the last thing I would just say is that in this era of a COVID pandemic, both organizations, the Minneapolis Foundation, the Warhol Foundation, really aren't thinking about their investment strategy. Jim, I was very interested in hearing that you are, but we are leaning into big time with our own resources and trying to raise money from caring donors to try to get dollars into the hands of the most vulnerable populations in the Twin Cities community, in the case of the Minneapolis Foundation, in the arts community, in the case of Warhol, who are just devastated, just completely have had the rug pulled out from under them and stood on their heads by this, by what's going on in the COVID world. And that's all hands on deck right now. Investments will wait for a later day in those two organizations. Back to you, Katie.
Thank you so much, John. And I'll add here that university endowments as asset owners, as John mentioned, they play a critical role in influencing corporate behavior. And in our organization, we know that there's about 650 billion in total endowment market in higher ed, and only about a quarter of that money considers environmental, social, and governance factors in their investment process. So our vision is to make what we call an intentionally designed endowments. So one that aligns investment practices with institutional mission and sustainability goals, the norm in higher ed. But as John mentioned, that alignment is difficult and it's a very long-term process. And with the pandemic, our organization is realizing that now more than ever, how interconnected we all are. And there are social and environmental system level risks that your endowment is exposed to, such as climate change, income inequality, and gender and racial diversity. And because the long-term performance of your endowment's investments depend on the health of our economy, the environment, and our people, more and more endowments will need and be expected to address these system-level risks, which are interconnected and complex. And we hope that with this new expectation, we see conversation moving from, why should we do this and invest this way, to why aren't we doing this already? And some of you have touched on this already with your introductory remarks, but when we think about climate action, we're thinking about the planet, but it's also about the people who are most affected by climate change and rectifying these impacts. So in your work, how do you think about social and economic equity, and how do you address that through your programming? And we can go in the opposite order. Maybe John, you can start us off, and then go to Austin, and then Jim.
Again, I would just say this, that in both the Minneapolis Foundation and Warhol's Foundation's cases, okay, addressing disparities of all kinds is a core objective of the grant making program. And that's been true for years, and there's no argument about it. Whether that's true when it comes to the investment portfolio, and if so, how to implement that, has turned out in both cases to be more complex. Back to, I wanted to bring up one very interesting dialogue I've been following, and that's the case of Yale University, which, like many, I went to Yale, and their chief investment officer is one of the most storied endowment investment officers in the country, David Swenson. And Yale students have been pressuring, and all large constituencies of the Yale universe have been pressuring the foundation to divest itself from bad actors in the carbon and climate change space. And David Swenson has resisted that. And his rationale for it is really interesting. This is a smart, committed guy. He's not a troglodyte. He doesn't believe that fiduciary duty is fiduciary duty. Well, what he has done, and I think this is a really interesting thing to have done, is he wrote a long letter, almost a white paper, to all the managers who manage portions of Yale University's endowments, and said, Katie, exactly what you just said, which is that we expect you, when you make investment decisions, to take into consideration all externalities, including the impact or the risk that companies bear when it comes to climate change. Okay, in other words, what is the risk to your investment from deteriorating global climate conditions? And you need to take that into consideration when you make your investment decisions. I haven't seen any follow-up studies to find out how that has worked, but that is an interesting way to address the problem. And I'm surprised that more organizations haven't pursued that path.
Just a quick jump in for a second. So Katie, Intentional Endowments Network has published 11 case studies of different universities pursuing sustainable investing. And some of them are even generating better returns. So can you speak any more to that about how Intentional Endowments Network is a magnet for dozens of universities and investors who are helping manage those funds?
Thank you so much. Yeah, I was noting down to circulate this resource that we have after this call, but we did release a financial performance report earlier this year, and it is a case study of 11 universities and colleges that participated in this study, and all of them tracked the ESG performance, ESG fund performance over the years, and this report is available on our website, and I'm happy to share it around after this call. But again, as they mentioned, the performance of these ESG funds were either outperformed or was comparable to rest of the funds, which did not incorporate or integrate ESG factors. So yeah, thank you so much for bringing that up. And Austin or Jim, I'd like to bring you both into the conversation if you have any reactions to John's comments.
I'd love to jump in. I think from our perspective, when we look at like our theory of change around climate, we see pretty clearly that our ability to have a healthy planet is so codependent with our ability for our society to be able to stand on their own 2 feet. And right now we just are not in that position. The majority of folks, even in wealthy countries, are struggling to have pathways to stability. And if we don't have the tools as people to live stable lives, then we definitely don't have the tools as a population and as institutions to come together to address a challenge at the scale of our planet. And so we've really focused on looking at policy recommendations that combine the best interlinkages between climate and economic opportunity. And what's interesting at this moment is that last year we were part of the SDG 8 review at the ILO. So for the first time, we're reviewing our progress on decent work and economic growth. And it was 30 UN chiefs and economists basically who couldn't have had more grim predictions for our progress on inequality. And we're speaking very candidly for 3 days. And a lot of the consensus in that room is that we need this component of the global Green New Deal that's been discussed, the jobs guarantee. We need to figure out how to move that forward as quickly as we can to be able to drive progress on a number of areas because it's core to success. No one saw a path forward to get that done in a systemic way. And I think what we've seen over a matter of weeks here is that we now have a level of urgency and a level of alignment. A lot of folks on the call today have talked about sort of our common mission, but a moment where we can decide what it looks like in the face of mass layoffs to move towards a society where everyone has a stable pathway to a job. And as part of that, we're going to be aligning with employers in the private sector to figure out what those jobs look like and which ones are going to be in demand and can bring sort of green jobs into that discussion and yeah, just change the tone and the dynamic of the conversation. So that's been sort of a tremendous realization for us over the past few weeks. If we were looking for a place of optimism, that's one.
Thank you. And I think we have a minute or two left. So Jim, would love to hear from you in response, anything that you have to comment on the previous remarks, but also like to do a round robin as well. And if you can give a quick idea or two about how students, faculty, or other higher ed leaders on the call can engage further to drive change and build more sustainable society. So what specific life actions they can take immediately after this panel will be really helpful as well, if you can add that to your comments. And I think you're muted.
I don't know that I have a lot of time to address all of those points, but I think there've been some really great ideas today. And, you know, we have really been pleased and surprised at the great work, commitment, passion that students have. We've been working with the program at the University of Utah for many years, and it's been a game changer, I think, as it relates to what we've been able to do with our foundation, what others have been able to do. And it's launched very many successful careers for students that then go on into the field and do what they learn. So I commend what you're doing here. We just need to do more. We need to come together. We need to work together. I think collaboration is key. And I think more of these convenings are very helpful.
John?
Educate and advocate. There's still a lot of resistance, particularly among people in my generation, to this whole notion that you should be investing assets and with anything other than long-term return as your objective. I think as Austin mentioned, though, people are gradually, but they need to be educated, buying into the notion that the notion of long-term return and responsible behavior towards the environment and other SDG goals are they're mutually reinforcing. They're not mutually exclusive, but people need to hear the story over and over and over again, and we need to educate and advocate. And I think the students who are a part of today's webcast could do a lot if they take up that mantle and carry it forward. Thank you.
I'd love to just reiterate that. I think to educate yourself and activate yourself in this moment, because there's never been more openness to people with bold ideas who have a real plan to get them done. And I think that second piece is really clear there, that we all see the urgency of the problems and see potential solutions, but you need to be twice as educated as anybody in the room in terms of how we can get there if you're putting forward strong ideas for systems change. We've seen a lot of really powerful intergenerational collaboration happening in this moment as we just come together more and more. So I'd say feel emboldened and prepared to sort of find your role in this movement.
Great. And I just want to add to the education piece that, you know, people on this call, you can look up if your school is reporting to ASHE's STAR system. The STAR stands for the Sustainability Tracking, Assessment, and Rating System, and understand your school's vision and approach to sustainability and what they're doing with their endowments. You can also just directly look up your school's investment policy statement and see if they consider sustainability in that way that they invest their endowments. And last but not least, this is kind of tangential but related. We can all be more intentional about who we're banking with. So instead of banking with banks that are, you know, funneling billions of dollars in the fossil fuel industry, you or your school, they could put their operational funds. You can bank with community development financial institutions, which are otherwise known as CDFIs, which fund community development and green investments. So I just wanted to add that in there. But with that, thank you again to Jim, John, and Austin for leading us through such a great session. And thank you all to the participants for joining in and asking such great questions. And I'm now going to turn it over to the organizers, who's going to wrap this eConference up. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Great. Doug, would you like to summarize? You're on mute.
Katie, thank you very much. And Jim, Austin, and John, I really appreciate your very valuable thoughts that you shared with the group today. This has been an incredibly valuable session. We couldn't have done it without all of you. So we're looking forward to continuing to work with our partners at HIP and Pottinger on the creation of other events, especially during this time of crisis, to educate and inform. So with that, I'd like to turn things back to Paul for a final wrap up and look forward to chatting with everybody soon.
Thanks, Doug, and thanks, Katie and panel, and appreciate everybody's time today. All of this has been recorded on ESGX.org and being simulcast on YouTube. Feel free to share this, share it along with your friends, your family, your professors, your endowment managers on campus to spur action. So inspired today by all the youthful enthusiasm, innovation, and tactical action, and the practical integration of sustainability into the classroom. And of course, the infrastructure that's been created by Jim Sorensen and John Barrett in terms of implementing sustainability into our world. All right, in every ESGX, Nigel or I cover some good news. So we're going to end on some good news and a preview. And remember that ESGX.org is no less than weekly, Tuesdays at 2 Pacific, 5 Eastern, 10 in London and Lisbon, 11 in Europe and Africa, and the next day morning in Asia Pacific. Nigel, over to you for good news. And you're on mute, maybe.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, go for it.
Aha, let me just get the right picture back and I will say that again. I think Elizabeth Davis said it best when she said business is social impact. And I think social impact is also good business. We've all learned in the last few months that life comes at you very fast in a crisis. And this makes it a wonderful time for learning. As a precursor to the good news, I put up some pictures here as a snapshot of my own learning experience, originally at King's Canterbury in the UK and then at Queen's College, Cambridge. This is the library. I confess, a place I did not go very often when I was there. A park in New York where I'm continuing to learn today, and the island of Sark, around once I which sailed completely by accident, teaching me unexpectedly the importance of having a very clear plan as to where you are going and trusting your navigation tools as you try to get there. If you want to know more, just Google the accidental circumnavigation of Sark, but don't try it yourself because there are all sorts of rocks around that island. Now, to the good news that we wanted to share this week, and we've had a lot today already in terms of the discussion from the floor. Sorry, I'm getting the wrong pictures here, but we have three things. First, Greta needs no introduction, but it has an extraordinary impact on raising attention around the world. And it's a reminder to us all that when we leave here today, we can go out and make some noise and try to act, and indeed get others to act. Secondly, in the middle, we have Estelle D. And if you caught the pre-roll video, we showed a snap of her speaking in Australia a few months ago, where she is leading a campaign to try to get solar PV fitted on the roofs of schools, which would cut costs, also contribute to the new peak power or peak time for demand in Australia, which is late afternoon and early evening, because the midday peak has gone because of all the solar already on roofs. And so again, another fantastic initiative which would have a massive impact both environmentally and economically. And thirdly, of course, how people are spending their money. We've talked about that. The University of New South Wales is committed to divest significantly, I think completely by 2025. And there are many other similar programs running. There's the Sunrise Movement, there's Extinction Rebellion, all of which are driving change, which is very welcome. Finally, a quick plug for what is coming up next week. And we have a really fascinating discussion here, which will center on the future of work, what industries are going to be most affected coming out of the COVID crisis. And there is change now underway, which has been accelerated by all of this. And of course, someone just a little while ago talked about the importance of collaboration. This session will be called Crisis, Collaboration and Creativity. And we have two great speakers, Veronica Monroe and Nigel Cumberland, both of whom come from the world of business and coaching and leadership, and trying to get the people to behave and act differently and give them the skills to do that. So with that as the good news, I wanted to thank again all the speakers, thank the audience without whom this would not have been as wonderfully interactive as it has been. Say good morning to everybody in the Asia Pacific, good afternoon in the Americas, and good evening for all of you who've stayed up late in Africa and Europe. We greatly appreciate it. So thank you from Paul Herman in San Francisco, me, Nigel Lake in New York, joining us on ESGX Live, the community for education, inspiration, and action. Thank you very much.